Who doesn't love a good story, even more so when it is cold and snowing, as it is behind me here today? I'm going to tell you a story, but contrary to the Hollywood norm, my story does not have a happy ending. It's the story of when a Jewish state rose to the Christian standard, love your enemy, only to be slaughtered in return. Now, if I were to ask a sample of you to name your favorite book of the Bible, I doubt the book of Leviticus would top any of your lists. Its very name is derived from the notion of Levitical law, which conjures up in the minds of many the image of the torturous minutiae related to the ancient Israelite laws that govern the purity of food, the washing of bodies and dishes, and the form of worship in what would ultimately become the Jewish temples in Jerusalem. Because of this legalese, Leviticus for many is a slog of a read, which causes them to quit partway through, if not avoid reading it altogether. Yet within the book of Leviticus, there's a verse so famous that it became axiomatic even to those entirely unacquainted with the Bible. What is this verse? Leviticus 19:18, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am Yahweh. That clause, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, is one of the most recognizable sayings from the Bible and is foundational to Judaism and Christianity alike. So much so that it has earned itself the moniker the Golden Rule. This command is regarded as so pivotal that both the rabbis and Jesus took pains to elaborate on it and even to expand its reach. Because of the first clause of the verse, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against your own people, many rabbis believed the neighbor being spoken of in the next clause of the verse was referring exclusively to fellow Israelites. Other rabbis therefore began to suggest it was therefore permissible to hate one's enemy or the non-Israelite. This causes Jesus to famously weigh in on the matter in the Sermon on the Mount, when he says, you've heard it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. Elsewhere in the book of Matthew and in Mark, Jesus teaches that the whole of the Torah depends on the two laws of loving God with all your heart, soul, strength, mind, which echoes Judaism's central proclamation known as the Shema, and loving your neighbor as yourself. In essence, the New Testament's command to love your enemy is asking people to see the humanity of their enemy and appropriate the dignity owed to him or to her or to them as one made in the image of God. But let's be honest with ourselves. In this increasingly cold and cruel world, rarely do we see acts of one loving their enemy. And you would be hard-pressed to find a single example of this principle governing relations between nations, let alone individuals. And yet, over the 26 years that I lived in Israel, and for as long as I've been observing the Arab-Israeli conflict, it seems that the world's nations have always demanded of Israel to extend a grace to its enemies that none of those nations have ever extended to their enemies. For the past 100 years, the Arab world first waged war to prevent the rebirth of a Jewish state in the land of Israel, then to destroy that state once it came into being. The very rallying cry of the Palestinian national cause has always been that genocidal slogan, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, which is to say free of Jews, by means of genocide or expulsion. The Palestinian cause has never shied away from expressing this goal, both in Arabic and in English, as is blatantly obvious when its adherents on North American and British campuses speak openly of this aim at mass rallies, and it doesn't seem to disgust their fellow students. And yet again, the world seems to demand that Israel extend to its would-be genociders a grace that no other nation would expect of itself in similar circumstances. Do you really believe that if Gaza had Russia as its neighbor instead of Israel, that Gaza would still be standing? Or if it had Syria as its neighbor and nemesis, that it would continue to exist? Personally, I don't believe that if a similarly genocidal entity bordered even the United States, that it would still exist. Let's be honest, it would have been pummeled out of existence long ago. And yet the world, including the USA, demands that Israel show a grace to the Palestinians that none of them would extend to a similar enemy which openly canvasses and acts towards its destruction. Well, once upon a time, Israel did rise to that Christian standard of love its enemy and extended to him an empathy and dignity allegedly owed to everyone made in the image of God. What enemy, you may ask? None other than Yahya Sinwar, Hamas's leader in the Gaza Strip. You see, back in 1989, Sinwar killed 2 Israeli soldiers and 4 Palestinians whom he considered to be collaborators with Israel, for which he was sentenced to 4 life sentences. In 2008, while serving time in an Israeli prison, Sinwar developed a life-threatening brain tumor, and Israel elected to love their enemy, sending him to be operated and tended to by the best care the Israeli medical system could provide, and thus saved his life. Without this intervention, he would surely have died. But Israel threw this sworn enemy a lifeline. Over 22 years in prison, Sinwar would go on to master Hebrew, speaking it without a noticeable Arabic accent, and learn also to the point of mastery the Israeli psyche. In 2011, Sinwar was released from prison as part of a lopsided prisoner exchange negotiated with Hamas, in which he, together with another 1,000 Palestinian security prisoners, many of them with the blood of countless Israeli terror victims on their hands, was traded in exchange for a single Israeli hostage named Gilad Shalit, who was a soldier taken captive by Hamas back in 2006. Sinwar was thus returned to Gaza and quickly recycled into Hamas's terror infrastructure, being elevated to that organization's leader in 2017. Any illusion that the grace that Israel extended to Sinwar by saving his life several years earlier would be returned in kind was shattered this past October 7th when he orchestrated the greatest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. And the sadism of this massacre has already been duly established. The killing and torture of entire families, babies murdered and burned alive, parents fastened to their children with wire, then being burned alive together, and of course sadistic acts played out on Israeli girls, the nature of which I can't speak about at length without earning a censure by YouTube. But I have appended to this video below an article by the not-so-pro-Israel New York Times regarding those crimes should you wish to pursue that topic further. So sometime back in 2008, the Jewish state of Israel practiced the Christian principle of loving your enemy on a level that historically Christian countries themselves have seldom, if ever, demonstrated. And how is Israel repaid? By an act of mass murder on a scale in death and in sadism seldom seen, and by myriads of college students and Generation Z TikTokers celebrating the sadism, and by too many governments, including the United States, imploring Israel to fight back with one hand tied behind its back. Anyway, that brings this story and episode to a close. Thanks again for your attention, and try to enjoy the rest of your day or evening wherever you are. Shalom.